All right, what is up, everybody? Happy Monday. I am super excited to be bringing this video to you guys this week. It's a little bit different than what we're used to with the typical deck construction videos and just going over different deck archetypes. We're going to go over the top 3 tips for ranked play in Legends of Runeterra. Basically, the top 3 things that you should be doing to ladder up in Legends of Runeterra. If you're new to the channel, my name is Justin, also known as Shit Just Works. If you're returning, welcome the hell back, and I am super excited to go over this stuff with you guys. I got some good feedback from my Runeterra Riot video that I had posted up last week. Link will be in the description below. Just kind of going over the metagame in general, and I got some feedback regarding just, the tips and stuff that we kind of went over in that video. So I decided to do another video based on just some general tips as far as ranked play, ladder play, and even some competitive play as well, because a lot of these tips also translate into tournament and competitive play. So without further ado, let's get into the 3 tips, and the last one is by far for competitive play too, because it's just assumed that this is to be done in competitive play. The third one is by far the most important. All right, so hopefully you guys, just to get started here, are familiar with the website that I currently have up. This is mobalytics.gg, and this website is absolutely ridiculously awesome as far as card statistics are concerned. There's a lot of other websites too that do this. There's a couple others I can think of that are pretty much just about as useful as Mobalytics. Mobalytics is usually my go-to site. So we have a lot of different tools here, such as you can search any card in the game. You can, deck manager, deck builder, and then also something called the meta tier list. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring this site up. So the very first tip here, and this is why I have this up, is to learn to play differently depending on the matchup at hand. So as an example, if you are, let's say, playing a more control-oriented deck, such as Heimer Control, let's say you're going against a burn aggro deck. Everybody loves going up against burn aggro. Am I right? Right? So you want to play completely different than if you were to go up against, let's say, a mid-range or another control deck. You're going to play different versus Endure Spiders than you would versus Tempo Sejuani, than you would versus Deep, etc., etc. So, as an example, and this says so much about the metagame and why a lot of the previous cards get changed. If you're going up against a burn deck and you are playing Heimerdinger, one of the key cards that you will almost always want to get in your first hand and keep in your first hand, multiple of if you can as well, is Thermogenic Beam. This is for various reasons, but if you guys recall, Legion Rearguard actually was recently nerfed to, from, I should say, 2 health to 1 health, which is a huge change, right? So if we pull up the burn aggro list here, you can see their 1-drops, right? They used to play 3 Legion Rearguard. It's basically just been cut from every aggro deck now due to the can't block. It's just not nearly as good of a card. The reason it was played so heavily and why it did so well against control matchups was because it got by Thermogenic Beam on turn 1, right? It had 2 health. Turn 1, you only have 1 mana. Thermo Beam only does 1 damage. Now, Teemo, 1 health. Legion Saboteur, 1 health. Precious Pet, 1 health. So in all instances, Teemo is usually doing 2 damage, Precious Pet's doing 2 damage, Legion Saboteur is doing 3. If you have Thermo and you're able to get rid of any one of these threats that your burn aggro opponent is playing on turn 1, you're saving 2 to possibly 3 damage to your face on the very first turn of the game, which is a huge advantage for an aggro deck to get if they are able to get that damage off. So that's just one example, right? Whereas if you're playing other matchups, you might not always want to keep Thermo Beam early. Now, granted, Thermo Beam is a very good card. So in a lot of matchups, it's going to do work, right? But just more specifically against burn aggro, it is a killer against burn. You need it so much. Other cards that you'd want to try to mulligan for would be maybe Mystic Shot, maybe even Get Excited. It doesn't feel great having to Get Excited a unit straight up. Usually you want to be going face or getting it in combination with Heimer to get a 3-cost turret. But if you're able to Get Excited something like a Boom Crew Rookie, now Boom Crew Rookie is at 3 health. another huge change to a burn aggro card. That's a good swing for you. Even though you're losing one card in card advantage by discarding for Get Excited, you're saving, again, potentially 3 damage due to Boom Crew Rookie and its effect. Which, with burn aggro matchups, you need to 100% of the time, the only thing that you should care about the entire game is your health. Nothing else matters. It doesn't matter if you're behind on the field, behind in card advantage, you need to stay as healthy as possible. All right. So although the third tip that we're going to go over is probably the most important here, and we'll get to that in a little bit, this is something that you will always be needing to do every single game. You're always going to need to be thinking, what is your opponent playing? How do I change my play style to kind of give me the best possible advantage against my opponent? And that's going to change based on matchups. Control versus burn is one of the easier ones to explain. You need to make sure you're mulliganing for either removal or heal. There's a lot of other intricacies as far as, one certain mid-range deck versus another mid-range deck. There's going to be specific cards that you want to mulligan for in most matchups, and that's something that you need to be on the lookout for always. All right, so the second tip, before we go over the third and probably most important tip, is going to be not just to adapt your play style, like, if you're playing control versus burn or vice versa, but to adapt the deck itself. And what I mean by that is there's actually 2 ways to go about this. So the first one is, if we're looking at this Heimer, we're going to stay on the Heimer control deck. You want to change out cards based on what you're seeing as far as matchups are concerned. So I'll just give you an example. And you can agree or disagree with this particular observation of mine anyways. So definitely comment below if you agree with this matchup as far as Heimer Control versus Endure Spiders and what your thoughts are. So basically what my thoughts are is that Heimer versus Endure Spiders is kind of a difficult matchup for Heimer, okay? And that's because Endure Spiders can typically swarm the board a little bit faster than the Heimer deck can actually deal with it during the first few turns. So by turn 4 or 5, especially if Heimer doesn't draw Vi, Endure is going to be able to just be swarming the board, dealing a ton of damage, and then even if you do remove their field, now they're going to have a huge They Who Endure that they can throw down. And there's really no way to get rid of the They Who Endure aside from Will of Ionia, and they're just going to end up playing it again, right? So kind of feels bad, or like a bad matchup for Heimer Control. So my first thought is, okay, maybe throw in some Eye of the Dragons in the Heimer Control deck to kind of give you a little bit of extra field presence early on in the game, and just allow you to get to that point where you can get Heimer on the field and start getting those elusives out. Because the other thing is, if you do get elusives down as Heimer Control versus Endure Spiders, they're really not going to be able to do anything against them. They have no real way of dealing with elusives other than Vile Feast, really. Vile Feast is going to be the only way that they can kill your elusives. Technically an Atrocity, but if you're having them use an Atrocity to kill your elusive, you're probably going to win the game anyways, right? So that's just my first thought. You could possibly take out a couple, Twin Disciplines for the Eye of the Dragons, just because you're not really needing to protect your units. Again, they don't have a whole lot of removal as far as protecting your Heimer. That's usually what the Twin Disciplines are in there for. You're getting rid of some 3-cost spells, sure, but you got to do what you got to do to win the matchup, right? So that's just one idea that comes to the top of my head. Again, if you guys disagree, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Heimer Control versus Endure Spiders matchup. So that's one way of just kind of adapting your deck to be a little bit more flexible versus certain matchups. You could throw any sorts of cards in there, and that's where these different variations of these builds come from. So just so that you guys are aware, in Mobalytics, again, you can actually see some different variations. So if you go to the meta stats over here, you can go to regions, you can click P and Z, you can click Ionia P and Z right here. You can kind of see just different win rates, different probabilities of people playing certain cards in the decks. You can see Will of Ionia, the win rate, the inclusion rate, how often it's included in PNZ and Ionia specifically. So there's a lot of different tools that you can use here to actually look up, what it is that your opponent might be playing. And wouldn't it be nice in any game to just kind of be able to predict what cards your opponent's going to play, right? Wouldn't that kind of help you win the game a little bit? Yeah. And that's what we're going to get into in the third tip here in just a second, which is why it's so important. But before we do that, let's get back to this meta tier list and pull up the Heimer Control. So the other thing, so not just changing certain cards in your deck, right, but also changing the deck itself. listen, sometimes your deck is just going to suck on a certain part of the ladder, right? And there's not much you can do about it. Sure, you know, if you're just like if you're in bronze and you're like a master tier player, you could probably play anything and just ladder up. Doesn't really matter what you play. That's a different situation. But when you're towards the upper ranks where everybody is pretty competent as far as the game is concerned and making the right plays most of the time, you're going to get to a point where if everybody's playing, you know, elusives and you're playing the one deck that just gets wrecked by elusives all the time, you're not going to win. You might win one game just because your opponent, I don't know, surrenders by accident. You know what I mean? So it gets really hard. So at certain points, you just need to just reconcile with yourself that, listen, I can't play the deck that I want to play because it's getting wrecked by everything else that everybody's playing. So you need to be playing a deck that counters what everybody else is playing. And if you're able to make that decision and be okay with it, 9 times out of 10, you'll ladder a lot quicker. Most of the time, people hold themselves back on ladder simply from just being stubborn and just wanting to play what they want to play. And I get that. It's a game. It's fun. You want it to be fun. You want to play the decks that you like to play. But if you are serious, you want to take this game seriously and be competitive and ladder up, you got to make decisions like that to be able to actually win and beat your opponent. And it's no different than tournament gameplay. You know, you select certain decks for a tournament because you're thinking about what other lineups of decks your opponent might have and those matchups. What are they going to ban out of your decks? What are you going to ban from their decks? And what is that going to leave you with to face up against whatever other decks they made, right? And you want to be trying to play the decks that counter those decks the best. So speaking of tournament, we get the third tip now. And the third tip, by far, I think is the most important. And that is scout out your opponent and know what they are playing. So what does that mean? How do you just look at your opponent's deck? Well, you can actually do this pretty easily. I'm not going to lie. And one of the perfect examples, without going through these meta stats and stuff, you can do it through going through here. Like I said, there's a whole slew of statistics on Mobalytics. But the meta tier list, 9 times out of 10, will be able to give you pretty quickly the information that you're going to need in whatever matchup you're in. So let's say you queue up, you're on ladder, you're in Plat, and you're playing Tempo Sejuani. And your opponent that you queue up against, they got Bilgewater Shadow Isles. And one of the things that you can see is not only what regions is your opponent playing, but the champions. So you see that not only are they playing Bilgewater Shadow Isles, they happen to have Maokai Thresh and Nautilus in their deck. Well, what does that probably mean? It probably means they're playing deep sea monsters. So what do? You come on over to mobalytics.gg, you pull up the deep monsters deck in the top tier list, the meta tier list, I should say, and boom, you have a deck list. Now, this is going to help you substantially in this matchup because, you know, on turn, 6 or whatever, and they only have 6 mana, or maybe they have 9 mana because they banked spell mana. You're going to go, okay, they have 9 mana. What possible combinations of cards could they play? This deck right here, Deep Sea Monsters, used to also play Vengeance, and sometimes it still does play Vengeance. This one in particular is showing Grasp of the Undying and Withering Wail. So honestly, Sea Monsters is probably the worst example for this just because it can vary so much. But again, 9 times out of 10, you are going to be able to get a good feel for what your opponent's playing with these deck lists. But as an example, Vengeance. Vengeance is not in this list, okay? So what that means is that if your opponent is on 7 mana, there's a good chance that they're not going to have Vengeance, and that's not a card that you have to play around. You know, if you don't have your opponent's deck list, obviously you still having to worry about Vengeance or Ruination or whatever is going to make you play differently. So that's something that you really, really, really need to take into consideration. As an example, like Deep Sea Monsters almost never play Ruination. So you know that if you are going up against Deep Sea Monsters, you don't have to play around Ruination. What that allows you to do is overextend a little bit on your field because you're not worried about somebody 5-for-1ing you with a Ruination and just wiping your whole field, right? And that's just one example. I mean, you have other decks like Deep Sea Monsters. The reason I say it's probably a bad example is because this can be played a lot of different ways. There's a good, 10 cards or so that can be swapped out in this deck beyond the actual sea monsters. Let's say you're playing something like Burn Aggro or against Burn Aggro. This deck doesn't typically change too much. You might have +1 or -1 Static Shock. You might have -1 Decimate or something, like just minor changes. But for the most part, this doesn't change. So with what your opponent's played and how much mana they have left on their turn, what they're probably sitting on or what they're trying to accomplish with their hand, especially with Burn Aggro, because obviously they're just trying to do quick math in their head to figure out how to get you to 0 in like 2 turns, right? So just really know what your opponent plays in tournaments, in the competitive scene. People have access to everybody's deck list before the tournament starts. There's a reason for that. I mean, it takes a certain level of skill to be able to still beat your opponent while both of you know what you're playing. Because at any given time, you typically know what your opponent does or doesn't have based on their deck list, and you know what to play around and what not to play around, and it makes it just a whole different level of playing the game than if you're on ladder, where it's just completely random, where they can randomly pull a Dusk and Dawn on you in a Weimerdinger deck that they main deck on a Vi, and then all of a sudden you lose because nobody prepares for a Dusk and Dawn on a Vi. So like there's stuff like that on ladder that just makes it completely different from tournament gameplay. So 100% pull up deck lists, check them out. They're not always going to be 100% accurate. There's going to be cards swapped out, but they will still give you a decent idea of what your opponent's playing. And let's be honest, there's a ton of people out there that net deck. So a lot of people are just probably playing these decks straight up as they are. All right. So I will say this game, you can see by how many A tier, like look how many A tier decks there are. That's insane. This game is definitely cool in that there are a lot of cards you can swap out and you don't get punished for it. So, but yeah, definitely look up what your opponent's playing. Always adapt your deck, adapt your play style based on what it is, you're seeing on ladder or what your opponent's doing, and learn matchups. Aggro versus control, control versus mid-range. What has the advantage? What doesn't have the advantage? So I hope all this helped you guys out. Honestly, I think that these 3 core concepts of playing ranked or even playing in tournaments are going to help you astronomically. So if you guys would like specific tips on specific matchups or how to play this deck versus this deck, definitely let me know in the comments below. I could try to do a video that goes a little bit more in depth as far as that's concerned, and I'd love to do that. Honestly, I think that these are super helpful tips for anybody who's new or even decently experienced with the game. So as always, everybody stay healthy, stay positive. I hope shit just works for you, and peace out.